WWE is reportedly set to unify the Raw and SmackDown Tag Team Championships. WWE has also officially announced the first stadium show in the United Kingdom in 30 years. Plus, Rhodes vs. Rollins Part 2 has been made official for WrestleMania Backlash. Last night was Monday Night Raw on the USA Network, so plenty of stories to get into in today's WWE news. Hey guys, welcome back to Wrestling News 365. Hope everyone is doing very well. As always, there are plenty of news stories to get into in the world of WWE. As mentioned, there is a lot. There is a lot to get into. So let's try and get through these as quickly as we possibly can because there's a lot of stories. Let's start off talking about possibly WWE unifying the Raw and SmackDown Tag Team titles. It looks like WWE will be unifying the Raw Tag Team titles and the SmackDown Tag Team titles after all. As we've noted yesterday, Friday's post-WrestleMania 38 edition of SmackDown saw undisputed WWE Universal Champion Roman Reigns cut a promo how he wanted SmackDown Tag Team Champions the Usos to have more gold. He then ordered them to Raw to take the titles from Raw Tag Team Champions Randy Orton and Riddle so that they can unify them. Now, last night's Raw saw RK Bro defeat Alpha Academy in a non-title match, and after the bout they were confronted by the Usos. Afterwards, between the two tag teams, the Usos challenged Orton and Riddle to a title unification match for the undisputed WWE Tag Team titles. Orton responded to the Usos, but the Street Profits interrupted to make a case why they should be next in line for a title shot. This led to a non-title main event, which saw the Usos defeat the Street Profits. After the match, the Usos and RK Bro faced off until the Usos left the ring. Ford and Dawkins attempted to attack RK Bro, but it backfired. The Usos then ran in and dropped Orton with a double super kick. Raw went off the air with the Usos raising both set of title bouts over Orton. Now, WWE hasn't announced right now when the title unification match will take place, but they did note the Usos versus the Profits was held to determine who deserves the right to challenge RK Bro next. WWE also noted in their Raw recap how the Usos win brings them one step closer to Reigns' mandate of unifying the gold. So logic would suggest we're moving towards a title unification match at WrestleMania Backlash. I don't want to go over it too much because we spoke about this quite in depth yesterday anyway. As I mentioned, I think it's probably a good thing, honestly. I think it's a good thing because the tag team divisions on both shows, there are decent teams involved in there, particularly on the Raw side. You've got RK Bro, you've got Alpha Academy, you've got the Street Profits, and whatever two single stars they decide to make a tag team in the future, like they did with Seth Rollins and Kevin Owens briefly. But the tag team division in WWE is shallow, so I don't have an issue with it. I think if you've got the women's tag team championships that are defended across both brands, if you hold the women's tag team titles, you do double duty. You can appear on both shows. Why not just do the same when it comes to the tag team titles? Now, for the men's side of things, now, when it comes to the WWE Undisputed Universal Championship, whatever it's called, the long title, how long that will stay undisputed, I'm not sure. We know the plan eventually is to split them back up because USA Network wants a champion on their show. And if Roman Reigns isn't going to be there every week, that's a problem. They have enough of that when Brock Lesnar was the WWE champion. So I don't think they'll want a situation where they don't have a champion every single week unless Roman Reigns is going to be appearing on both shows. Then I think they'd be happy for that to be the case, but it's just not going to happen. So I think that we could see a situation where, yes, Roman Reigns drops one championship, possibly the WWE championship, possibly the Cody Rhodes. But it comes to the tag team championship, I think it's a good thing. I really do. I think it's a good thing to have the tag team championships be unified because, again, they do it with the women's tag titles. Why don't they do it with the men's tag team titles? And the brand split doesn't mean anything anyway at this point, so I really don't have a problem with it at all. Now, this is an announcement that, of course, I'm very excited about, considering I am from the UK. But for the first time since the 1992 SummerSlam at Wembley Stadium, WWE will return to the United Kingdom for a stadium show this September. WWE announced today that a major stadium event will emanate from the Principality Stadium in Cardiff, which is in Wales, on Saturday, September 3rd, 2022. No further details were announced. If you're not familiar, the Principality Stadium hosts a ton of different events, stadium shows. Obviously, they Also have, the football team, the rugby team play there as well. So it holds roughly 75,000, but a boxing fight in 2017 featuring Anthony Joshua reportedly brought in around 78,000 fans. They'll probably get around 75 to 80,000. Drew McIntyre has previously floated the possibility of a match against Tyson Fury at a stadium event in the United Kingdom. Tyson Fury is actually fighting at Wembley in April. This has been planned for a really long time, going back to 2020. The plan was to do this in 2020. Before the pandemic, the idea was that Drew McIntyre wins the WWE Championship at WrestleMania. Then they do a stadium show, which would probably have Drew McIntyre versus Tyson Fury for the WWE Championship, and somehow they get out of it. That was always the plan, right? Remember all of that back and forth that they had on social media? Tyson Fury and Drew McIntyre, it was for that reason. It was to set up a match at that show. I have no doubts, and I don't even think it depends on the outcome of Tyson Fury's fight against Dillian Whyte. I do think Tyson Fury wins, but even if he were to lose, maybe they would have the rematch later on in the year, so maybe that would take him out of it. But I think the idea is that Tyson Fury will be wrestling on that show. Drew McIntyre, a lot of people have said maybe that's when Roman drops the championship to Drew McIntyre on that show. I don't see Roman Reigns dropping the championship, not even to the very earliest WrestleMania next year, and I think he wins then anyway against The Rock if he faces The Rock. So I think we definitely could see a main event of Drew McIntyre versus Roman Reigns for the Undisputed Universal Championship at this show. But I think Roman Reigns would retain, but it would do big business. Every time anyone does anything involving pro wrestling over here in the UK, it does really big business. Even Impact Wrestling was on Challenge TV. They could sell out arenas in the UK because the passion and the lust for pro wrestling is so high here. So great news, very exciting, and it's going to be interesting to see what they call it, what matches they have planned, how seriously they take it. But it's a really exciting news story for all of the UK fans. Now, WrestleMania Backlash, we have another match announced, a match that a lot of people expected to be announced, but WWE has announced a big WrestleMania 38 rematch for the upcoming WrestleMania Backlash Premium Live events. It will feature Cody Rhodes versus Seth Rollins 2. This will be a rematch from Rhodes' return to WWE at WrestleMania 38, which saw him defeat Rollins in singles action. Now, this week's Raw opened with Rhodes on Miz TV, which we'll talk about in a second. But it led to Rhodes' first match back on Raw against The Miz later on in the evening, where Seth Rollins watched from ringside. Now, Cody Rhodes got the victory. After the match, Rollins confronted Rhodes in the ring and challenged him to Part 2, the rematch. WWE later confirmed the match for WrestleMania Backlash after Raw went off the air. Again, I found it really surprising that people thought that the Rhodes versus Rollins feud was over just because they shook hands last week. I was like, well, of course it's not over. Like, it's just not going to be over. I mean, whenever two rivals have a great match, WWE always milks it, and pretty much WrestleMania Backlash, most years, or Backlash, whatever you want to call it, features a lot of WrestleMania rematches, and I didn't expect this one to be any different, especially after Shinsuke Nakamura confronted Roman Reigns on SmackDown last week. I think there was maybe some feeling that maybe Rhodes would challenge Roman Reigns, but that didn't, to me, make any sense. I think you save that for later on. Maybe a stadium show. There's several this year, whether it's Money in the Bank, SummerSlam, the UK one, whatever. So that's just not going to happen. I'd be really shocked if that was the case, and it's not. So yeah, I think this is going to be a great match. I think the tale that they can tell here is that last time the match was great, but it was a surprise on Rollins. Rollins didn't know his opponent. This time he does. They'll have another great match. I think Cody has to win. If he doesn't win, if they go 50-50 booking, I would be shocked because... did you see Cody Rhodes' entrance last night on Raw? It was insane, in terms of the pyro. I mean, literally, he rivals Roman Reigns with that pyro that goes off when he comes out, which is funny because in AEW, people used to criticize Cody Rhodes for that, going, like, how much pyro? You're just reinforcing. He's a big star. He's a big star. Exactly the same in WWE. How long that lasts, I don't know. But look, it's going to be a great match. No doubt it's going to be a great match, and I look forward to it. If it's anything close to their WrestleMania match, it's going to be fantastic. Now, speaking of Rhodes, as I mentioned, he was on Miz TV last night, and this is a really fun kind of story here. So this week, as I mentioned, Raw kicked off with Miz TV featuring Cody Rhodes. At one point in the segment, Rhodes reiterated that he returned to WWE with one specific goal, to capture the WWE Undisputed Universal Championship. Rhodes told The Miz, quote, what do you think I've been doing for 6 years? And every piece of that road provides me with the crystal clear clarity on not what I want to do, what I need to do, and that is to win the undisputed WWE Universal Championship bout. In response, The Miz referenced a popular Vince McMahon quote, "It's a title. A belt holds up your pants," The Miz said, which led to WWE Hall of Famer Jerry the King Lawler bursting into laughter on commentary. Now, this, again, is... this is a Vince McMahon quote. It's always because you don't call them bouts, you don't call them wrestlers, you know, they're titles, they're superstars. You don't call it this business. Now, there are certain exceptions to the rule. For instance, Becky Lynch was Becky 2 bouts and all that kind of stuff. But look, whenever anyone says this kind of stuff, so when he did the promo last week, Cody Rhodes, he said bout several times. He said about the WWE Championship bout and the Universal Championship bout. And whenever you hear these words or you call them wrestlers, I, as a viewer, I'll be honest here, I sort of cringe. I don't cringe because I hate the word. I cringe because I know Vince McMahon's probably going crazy. And I go, oh, just, you know, that's just what it is. I have no issue with them being called bouts. I think people that have massive issues have just been conditioned by WWE for years that that's what they're called, and it's horrible, and, you know, that's just whatever. But I feel like maybe he did the promo last week and said bout and said wrestlers and all the professional wrestling, which Vince McMahon doesn't like. It's sports entertainment, right? All that kind of stuff. I feel like he said that last week and then maybe got backstage and Vince either said something to him or whatever. This was far more scripted, and this was intentional by The Miz and probably by Cody as well, because they did a couple of other references on the show and all that kind of stuff. So look, it's not a big deal, but it's interesting. And maybe, look, if they're going to go that direction of Cody being about wrestling and using terminology that other people aren't allowed to use, then I'm all for it. This was odd. Bianca Belair, her first challenger for the Raw Women's Championship, is none other than Sonya Deville. WWE on-screen official Sonya Deville is set to challenge Raw Women's Champion Bianca Belair for the title. Now, on Raw last night, Belair defeated Queen Zelina Vega in a quick non-title match. After the match, Deville came to the ring with an open contract for Belair's next challenger, her first since defeating Becky Lynch to win the title at WrestleMania 38. Deville called for a drum roll and gave a grand introduction, but then attacked Belair from behind and proceeded to beat her up. Deville then revealed herself to be Belair's next opponent for the title. Her colleague Adam Pearce later stopped her backstage and accused her of abusing her power. Deville said she will be the first WWE official to answer an open challenge, and she will shock the world when she wins the Raw Women's Championship. Deville also warned Pearce that there's nothing he can do to stop her from challenging Belair and making history. Look, I think this is, I saw a lot of outrage about this. I would assume that this is just a case of tying up this whole Sonya Deville is an abusive official, abuses her power and all that kind of stuff. She will get fired and then become a wrestler again. Like, I'm surprised. I didn't really understand why that didn't happen in that Naomi feud that lasted months and was just stupid and illogical. It felt like they must be building to something, and they never really did. They had a match on SmackDown. They did another thing at the Royal Rumble, and then just never really revisited it. Never explained why Sonya Deville didn't like Naomi. She just doesn't like her. And there was no repercussions for it, right? Which was just odd. So surely this is the way that they tie up the storyline of her abusing her power and eventually she becomes a wrestler again or something like that. That has to be the case. Otherwise, it's just dumb. Like, it really is just dumb. And I look, they've done that in the past with people abusing their power, but eventually they always get their comeuppance, and people like Vince McMahon do it because he owns the company. Sonya Deville doesn't. She's just an official. She's not even a general manager. She's just an official. So, given the fact that she said to Adam Pearce, there's nothing you can do to stop me, blah, 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 implies that there is. That is pro wrestling. Everything's the opposite. So, I mean, Bianca Belair's not going to drop the title to Sonya Deville. It's a fine first championship feud for Belair, but the logic is kind of on shaky ground. We spoke yesterday about Brandi Rhodes having productive talks with WWE, and she seemingly teased returning to WWE TV at some point in the future. During the Cody Rhodes versus The Miz match on this week's Raw, Brandi live tweeted the following quote, "You never know, ... we spoke about yesterday, Brandi reportedly had, quote, many productive conversations with several influential WWE names backstage at WrestleMania 38. She's been working on her unscripted content and has also continued training in the ring. Now, obviously, previously it was reported she won't be joining her husband in WWE. Brandi Rhodes coming in was not part of the Cody Rhodes return. As I mentioned yesterday, I feel like it's inevitable. It will happen because WWE just creative. Eventually, they just do stuff. So the fact that I think they will revisit Cody Rhodes versus The Miz at some point, because I did feel like there was something there during the Miz TV segment last night. I mean, I could absolutely see a future WWE title feud, right? We spoke about Bianca Belair just then, about first championship feuds after. The first championship feud after you win the title is a feud that the champion always wins. I could absolutely see a scenario where Cody Rhodes wins the WWE Championship, and his first feud for the WWE title was against The Miz. He's always going to beat The Miz, but as is the case always with The Miz, if you've got, because Maurice is his wife and she's a former wrestler, if he's going up against a person whose wife is also a wrestler and Brandi Rhodes, they'll do something there. So I wouldn't be shocked if she shows up in the future. Not anytime soon, but I think that it will happen at some point in the future. It's inevitable. This week's Raw saw another title change, name change rather, in Austin Theory. Austin Theory is no more. It was revealed during last night's Raw that WWE has dropped the Austin first name, and the up-and-coming WWE superstar is now billed by just his last name, Theory. Raw featured a backstage segment where Theory confronted Adam Pearce and Sonya Deville, revealing to them how WWE Chairman and CEO Vince McMahon has promised him a shot at Finn Balor's United States title. Theory then revealed the name change, noting how he and Mr. McMahon decided that just Theory is better moving forward. Pearce then ruled that Theory vs. Balor will take place on Raw next week for the title on the line. Look, WWE, when it comes to name changes, they can't help themselves. I'm kind of done being outraged by them, honestly, or the whole dropping the first name, because frankly, whenever WWE does drop the first name, whilst I'm never usually a fan of it, and I'm certainly not a fan of this one, because Theory, it's just weird. And people, because of course people just go through lives with one name, right? We're all Madonna or Prince. I don't know. But I'm kind of done being outraged and just being angry about it. Like, eventually, and this is why they do it, eventually you do get used to it, right? People could just call him Riddle. Some people still call him Matt Riddle, but people would mainly call him Riddle. It was the same with Cesaro. You know, for a while people called him Antonio Cesaro, but eventually they drop it and they just call him Cesaro. Shotzi's the same. That's just what WWE does, and eventually you do get used to it. So I don't think it's the biggest deal in the world. Now, I would assume that they had him drop the Austin part of his name because of Stone Cold Steve Austin. The issue is that that's past. Like, if that was the reason why, that's past. Unless Steve Austin's going to come back to wrestle more matches, then maybe that's why it happened. If not, I don't know why it's just decided now, but that's what WWE does. Randomly, I say WWE, Vince McMahon some days just decides, why are we calling him Austin Theory? Oh, there's Stone Cold Steve Austin. He should just be Theory. Right, they did it with Mustafa Ali. One day he was just Ali. And then he was Mustafa Ali again. He grew a first name again. That's what WWE does. So I'm kind of done being outraged by it. Is it stupid? Yeah. But will we get used to it? Yeah. So I don't really have much of an issue with it, honestly. Rhea Ripley missed Raw last night. Now, obviously, she was meant to be competing in a women's tag team title match. That didn't happen. Ripley was off last night's Raw due to protocols. Now, WWE had previously announced that Ripley and Liv Morgan would challenge for the WWE Women's Tag Team Championships against Sasha Banks and Naomi. However, Morgan ended up taking a singles loss to Naomi. It was noted on commentary that Ripley was off last night's Raw due to being in protocol. WWE then announced the title match for next Monday's Raw. Ripley was also not on last Friday's SmackDown as Morgan defeated Sasha Banks in singles action. Ripley did wrestle last Monday on Raw for the post-WrestleMania 38 Raw as she and Liv took a loss to Banks and Naomi in a non-title championship contenders match, but they were still granted a title shot anyway, which is just dumb. I assumed that the title match last night was going to actually serve as a heel turn for Rhea Ripley, which I still think it will. When they say protocol, I'm really hesitant, to speculate on people's medical issues, all that kind of stuff. Logic would suggest it's probably COVID. She's probably tested positive for COVID, hence why missing SmackDown, hence why missing Raw, and will probably be back next week. Again, that's speculating on my part, which I'm never really comfortable doing, but that's the logical situation. I talk about logic. There was no logic in them getting a title shot anyway. They lost last week, but she just went backstage. Even though we lost, I won a title shot. Okay. And there's been rumors about Rhea Ripley joining Edge's heel group, which, by the way, the whole Damian Priest thing last night was just bizarre and badly done. But I could see Rhea Ripley joining that group, and I felt like the heel turn would have probably taken place last night, but of course she wasn't there, so I think it will probably happen next week. This is a really fascinating story. The Undertaker is going to be hosting a podcast. Yes, that is real. Dead Man Talking is finally going to happen. 2022 WWE Hall of Famer The Undertaker is reportedly getting into podcasting. A new report from WrestleVote says Peacock and WWE officials have convinced The Undertaker to launch his own podcast show, which would be similar to the Broken Skull Session series hosted by Steve Austin. Taker's new show is expected to begin airing within the next few months. A fascinating concept that was unfathomable, easy for me to say, a few years back, the report noted. There's no word yet on the title of Taker's new show or who his first guest will be, but of course we'll keep you updated. Look, I think so many people would be fascinated to see it. A guy that has just basically didn't talk for like 30 years, hosting his own show, doing interviews is pretty wild, and I'm sure he's got a lot of stories to tell about lots of people. Recently, every time The Undertaker does an interview, people get upset because they find out really who Mark Calloway is, and some people don't like that. I think it will be fascinating. It will do great numbers. Whether or not they can do that, like the Dead Man Talking is just a great name, but that trademark, I believe, is owned by Conrad Thompson. And I think he said previously that there were never any plans to do a podcast with The Undertaker. It might have been for a StarCast show he was hoping to do, and then, of course, it didn't happen because Taker re-signed with WWE. Whether or not WWE goes to Conrad and says, hey, we'll buy it off you, or they just come up with something different, which is they'll probably come up with something different. But Dead Man Talking is such a great name, that maybe they have that conversation. I don't know. But it was certainly going to be fascinating, no doubt about it. Quickly, we'll talk about the ratings for SmackDown on Friday because they're quite interesting, actually. The post-WrestleMania 38 edition of SmackDown drew an average of 2.230 million viewers on Fox, according to Nielsen via Showbuzz Daily. Now, the final number is actually down 5.46% from the previous week's final viewership of 2.359 million viewers. Friday's WrestleMania SmackDown drew a 0.60 rating in the 1849 key demographic, which is actually down 1.63% from the previous week's 0.61 rating, which again is somewhat surprising. Now, SmackDown ranked number 1 in the ratings for the 18 to 49 key demographic on network TV, which of course is even from the prior week's number 1 ranking also. It also ranked number 1 in the 18 to 34 demo this week, tying with the previous week's number 1 ranking as well. And it also ranked number 1 in the 25 to 54 demo, which is up from the prior week's number 4 ranking. SmackDown came in 7 for the night in terms of viewership on network TV, which is up from last week's number 8 rating. The SmackDown episode was down, less than 1%. It's flat, basically, from the same week in 2021. The key demo rating was down 1.6%, essentially the same. There was strong competition that night. The Masters Golf was on ESPN. It topped the cable top 150, and it topped in terms of viewership, so that's probably the factor of that. But it is somewhat surprising, I suppose, that the post-WrestleMania show actually had a bit of a dip. Maybe it's just because there was a stretch of time between that SmackDown episode and WrestleMania in comparison to last week, where it's the day before WrestleMania, so the excitement's at a peak, and then a few days later, the people have kind of been a bit wrestlinged out, if you will, and maybe that's why. But certainly a little bit surprising there, but still, they'll be very happy with those numbers, so will Fox. Finally, speaking of WrestleMania, coming out of WrestleMania Sunday, the Brock Lesnar-Roman Reigns match, the finish was very flat. People thought that maybe Roman Reigns was injured, something went wrong, but reportedly, the main event of WrestleMania 38 went off as planned. It exactly went to plan. WrestleMania Sunday was headlined by Roman Reigns defeating Brock Lesnar to become the inaugural undisputed WWE Universal Champion. There had been some speculation on Reigns possibly suffering a shoulder injury, which may have even led to a quicker finish than what was planned, but that was not the case. According to Dave Meltzer on the Sunday night's main event podcast, it was noted that Reigns did not suffer an injury, and that the match went down as it was planned and laid out. The bout was meant to finish the way it did at around 12 minutes of in-ring action, which again is surprising because the finish was really flat. If nothing went wrong, then the finish was just odd, really, really odd, and really, really strange. And again, that is surprising. I mean, I didn't think Reigns, I guess, was... I mean, coming out of it, you assume Reigns might have been injured because of the way it ended and the way he was holding his shoulder. But the fact that we've seen him on television, on Raw and SmackDown, we haven't seen him wrestle, but he doesn't wrestle that often on television anyway. So, yeah, that was slightly odd. Very odd that that was the finish, but... hey, they got what they wanted. Anyway, guys, let me know your thoughts on today's WWE news stories in the comment section below. Be sure to like and subscribe to Wrestle News 365, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.